is a community education production brought to you by the Bar Association of Montgomery County and the Montgomery County, Maryland Bar Foundation. The program is designed to provide you with general information regarding your rights and obligations under the law. It is not intended as specific legal advice. You should discuss the facts and circumstances of any particular matter with your own attorney and obtain advice specific to your case. The participants are local attorneys who have volunteered their time to bring you this program. We hope you find it informative and beneficial.
Welcome to Law School for the Public. My name is David Schoenfeld, and I am a partner with Bonner, Kiernan, Trebeck, and Crociata. Our liberties are protected in large part by a free press, which, although not part of our government structure, is often referred to as the Fourth Estate. Many people do not fully understand how the structure of our government ensures the separation of power and the role the free press plays in protecting our democracy. To help us understand the role of the free press, we are fortunate to have with us two guests who are extremely knowledgeable in this area of law. Derek McGinty is a broadcast journalist. You may recognize Derek from his years of service as an anchor on WUSA Channel 9 News. In his 35 years of journalism, Derek has hosted his own nationally syndicated talk show, was a correspondent for HBO's Real Sports with Brian Gumbel, and an anchor for ABC News. Derek is a native of Washington and a graduate of American University. Andrew Hahn graduated from the University of Illinois and obtained his law degree from Catholic University. Andrew is an assistant state's attorney with the Montgomery County State's Attorney's Office. He is a county prosecutor handling cases for the Special Victims Unit. Andrew is also a captain in the Maryland Army National Guard. Andrew, Derek, welcome.
Great to be here.
Thank you.
Andrew, tell us a little bit about what it is you do.
Sure. I work in the Special Victims Unit for the Montgomery County State's Attorney's Office, and we handle primarily sex assault cases, child abuse cases, and child sexual abuse cases.
So just like we see on television.
Just like you see on television, yes.
And Derek, what is it that you do?
Well, I'd like to say I'm a recovering broadcaster. I did it for a long time. I'm sort of in semi-retired mode now. Still very much into the news, still very much keeping up with what's going on, just not reporting on it right now.
Still a news junkie.
Yeah.
Still a news junkie. So we're going to talk a little bit today about separation of powers and how the press fills in and assists in the functioning of our government, which is really what the separation of powers ensures. And to start, the separation of powers really is a political doctrine, and it urged sort of the constitutional structure where each structure of our government is separate. It's a French idea, and it impacted the writing of our Constitution. And in fact, our Constitution, which I know you have a copy of because I gave it to you earlier, is available.
I do?
You do. Props, how about that? Is available to anybody who wants to read it online. You can go to the government printing office, which is where I got that copy, and just print it. But interestingly, the Constitution our government is inherently inefficient. It is set up that way to protect our freedoms, not efficiency. I mean, is that really where we are?
Well, I think the numbers of entities that are involved in the process of making a law, executing a law, interpreting a law, it's a very deliberate process. And the reason why it is deliberate is that one side doesn't get over another side and one side isn't swept underneath the rug.
And there's 7 articles to our Constitution. That's it. The first 3 deal with the structure of our government, right?
Right.
And the first is the legislature. So I know it's basic, but tell us what the legislature, our national legislature, is.
Sure. The legislature, according to the Constitution, is divided into 2 houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives, and their job is to write the law based on the views that are presented by their constituents and what's best for the nation. They will draft the law according to whatever needs that the nation is requiring, such as health care, such as crime and punishment, such as environment, and they will draft the law, pass it on both sides, and ultimately send it off to the president to be signed.
And the president, which is Article 2, that's the executive. But the executive, he or she runs the government, right?
Correct. The president is given executive powers to run the government, to execute the laws of the nation. And when the president gets a bill from Congress. His job is either to sign it and agree and put it into law, or to veto it and send it back and say, Congress, work on this some more.
Which is the check on the Congress.
Exactly.
And then we have, and obviously the president does more, and we can talk about that, but then we also have the one that you know the most, the judiciary, which is Article 3.
Right.
So how, and there's difference between the state and the federal courts. So tell us a little bit about the federal courts, which is really what we're here for.
Well, the federal courts are broken down into three main steps. There's the district court, which is the lowest level court. Then you have your court of appeals, your appellate division that reviews the district court. But the highest level court is obviously the United States Supreme Court. And in the Constitution under Article 3, it is the highest court in the land. So whether your case comes from the state or from the federal side, the Supreme Court has the power to hear the case. If it comes through the states, however, there has to be a constitutional dimension to your case in order for the Supreme Court to rule on it.
Talking about checks and balances, the judiciary, how does that, it's the ultimate check and balance, isn't it?
Absolutely. It is the last step in the process. They have the power of knowledge, of past case precedent, and what they're really using is the Constitution, what we've printed out right here. They look at a case and they see what part of the Constitution applies and whether or not that case, whatever law it carries, violates the Constitution. And they're the ones that essentially interpret the Constitution based on the cases that they've interpreted before, the case they've decided on before, and they'll say this case violates the Constitution for such and such reason, or that this case is in line with the Constitution for such and such reason.
If I can break in
Sure,
here,
absolutely.
the most interesting thing to me about the judiciary is it has no power at all outside of what people invest in it. There's no army.
There's no army.
There's no federal cops that are going to come around and make you do things that the court says you should do. As a matter of fact, when you think about it, after Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, a lot of people were very excited and thought schools were going to immediately desegregate. Mm-hmm. They did not. It took decades for schools to desegregate after that because a lot of people just said, well, we're not doing it, right? And then you'd have to take them to court and then try to get them to do it. So the fact that the institution really only has the power of our belief in the institution to make it work is one of the most amazing things to me.
Which is a concern, and one of the things that I want to talk today about, which is this assault on the press and this assault that we've seen recently on our courts. Because, as you said, Derek, the courts have no inherent power. There is no army behind the courts. So the enforcement of the law is left up to the executive. And if the executive doesn't choose to enforce it, that's where the press steps in.
Right.
And that's, I mean, look, we can use the example which has been in the news lately, and without getting into politics too much, about executive orders. And we've heard a lot about executive orders. Our free press has told us quite a bit about the recent executive orders. But Andrew, what is an executive order?
Well, an executive order is issued by the president, and it is an order geared towards the federal agencies on how to execute the laws of the state. It has the same effect as law and is under the same scrutiny as law. So in other words, the courts can take an executive order if it's filed as part of a complaint and interpret that executive order and determine whether or not it is a good law or a bad law. Good law meaning it's constitutional, bad law meaning it's not.
I would make the argument that those executive orders have become larger and more important as Congress has become less able to do its job. So presidents always want to have more power. They always want to do things maybe the Congress would rather them not do. So they use executive orders. Well, the less Congress can actually legislate and create laws, that just leaves more room for presidents to accrue power. And I think a lot of people would argue that the executive branch has become more and more powerful as the Congress has become more and more dysfunctional.
And the role of the press. What does the press do with these executive orders?
Well, I don't think the press has a special role with regard to the executive orders. Certainly, when I was in journalism school, which was some time ago now, we had this idea that we were a check on the abuse of power in general, right? And if a president was doing something or Congress was doing something that was against the law, was hurting the people, what we were supposed to do was point it out. And the harsh glare of publicity is supposed to, force folks to do something different. And sometimes it does, sometimes it does not. But executive orders, as long as they're legal, you know, a lot of times I think the press is going to look at it and go, there's no story here.
So when it becomes a story, and we've seen the recent executive order, which has been in the press a lot, is
Right.
having to do with the travel ban. And that has gotten a tremendous amount of press. But why does the press, and using that as an example, latch on to something like that?
Okay, well, a couple of things. A, it's controversial. Right? A lot of people thought it was a bad order and should never happen, and they went to court to stop it. So when was the last time you saw a president issue an executive order, see it overturned by the courts, it goes back to the president, he puts out another one, which even he says is watered down. It goes back to the courts, it's overturned again, and then he appeals, it's overturned again. I mean, it's a tremendous, that is a story, right? That is a tremendous story. And the fact that it's Donald Trump, and there's, you know, 55% of the people now don't like him or think he's doing a bad job, you know, it makes it even more interesting. So, you know, this situation is a special case, let's just say.
And if it wasn't for the press, I think these executive orders would probably just be executed normally.
Right.
And people would be affected, and no one would have any idea what's going on. And the reason why the press is so important is to bring light to the public that this is happening, and it's going to affect you. And so that they can curtail that. And I think that has an effect on how state governments, in this case, have filed suit against Trump's executive orders and have started the process of issuing injunctions to stop the execution of those executive orders.
Do you have to go to court? Is there anything else that they can do to stop an executive order?
Well, Congress can obviously pass a law that makes the executive order null or invalid.
And why would we not do that?
Well, as we said earlier, it takes a while for a law to come into place, right? You got to put it into a committee. Committee's got to put a bunch of drafts through it. Then that has to go to the House floor. Then it goes through a vote. Then it's got to go to the Senate, and it has to go to their committee, and they have to vote on it. And when you go through all the processes, and then you finally have to send it up to the president. Now, the president can sign it or veto it. Well, let's say he vetoes it, he sends it back. Then what happens? You have to get a 3/4 majority. Two-thirds majority to get the veto overridden.
And I would just say this: Congress could move faster on some of these type of things if they wanted to, but to think about what would have to happen for the Congress to overturn an executive order. First of all, the opposite party from the party in power would have to be in both houses of Congress, right? Because if you're Democrats in the White House and you got a Democratic Congress, they're not going to overturn his executive orders just on political principles, right? So that's never going to happen. So you got to have a president has to be the opposite party from both houses of Congress, right? And then they've got to be willing to go through that. And then you've got to have enough of a majority, as you say, to overturn his veto. So it's just so difficult.
So it's nearly impossible.
It's very, very hard.
So the courts are easier?
I wouldn't say it's easier, but I think it's a more effective method. I say effective because it moves faster. Imagine this. If you had that particular executive order and we had Congress being the only check, that executive order would be in place for months, and people would be harmed by it for those months until a law is passed.
But the recent executive order was not in place for months. In fact, it was stayed immediately. So how does that work?
Well, what happened was...
Talking about checks and balances.
Sure. Well, what happened was in Hawaii was one of the states. They filed a claim in district court, in the federal district court in Hawaii, and that judge said this one is wrong, and they put an injunction on it. A court here in Maryland, in Beltsville, basically said the same exact thing. And then we start the appeals process. Now, the court's orders are applicable to the federal agencies. So in this particular case, the Department of Homeland Security, which kind of runs the immigration processes and procedures, are beholden to that order.
And could it just be a district court?
It could be a district court.
So you know, we see people talk about, oh, the Supreme Court hasn't ruled on it yet. That's what they say.
Right.
But it doesn't matter, does it?
No, not right now. Right now, an order has been placed by a federal judge. It has a large impact right now. What happens is, as different courts start to interpret this law differently, or there's more controversy to it, or as it rises up to the next appellate level, and that's argued up there, and right now the executive order is rising to that appellate level, and which I think it has in the Fourth Circuit, and then it'll go to the Supreme Court and make the ultimate decision.
Right, and the court could decide not to decide, right? If
Right.
all the appeals courts agree, the court would say, well, there's no reason for us to step into this because there's not a disagreement about this on a legal level, at least from the appeals courts, from the federal court point of view, and we don't have to step in.
The Supreme Court can step in. They can choose to take it. They can issue a writ of certiorari and say, you know what, we'll hear the case because it has constitutional dimension, and they might believe that they need to say something about this once and for all.
Once and for all, let everyone know. The press. So the press, when we were preparing for the show, we had sort of a different take on the press and some of the phrases, and I think you used guardian of democracy, and I actually used a tagline, which you're laughing, but I've been reading in the Washington Post, and I'll give them credit, which is democracy dies in darkness. And I love that line because I firmly believe that you need the free press. So you were starting to tell me in preparing for the show a little bit about the news. Right. And how it became what it is. So why don't you share a little bit of that?
I would say a couple of things. First of all, about the democracy dies in darkness line. I would say a couple of things. I find it a little melodramatic. I think it has impact and certainly a lot of relevance as to what's going on right now. But you know, in some years there's going to be another president who's not nearly so controversial. Are you still going to be democracy dies in darkness?
Sure, I mean, why not?
I don't know. Maybe it won't feel as relevant. But in any case, that being the case, that being said, we were talking about the fact that the press has changed so much, and the job description is much different than it used to be.
And even what media is.
And even what media is, right? It has changed a lot. I mean, back, you know, this is the kind of thing they used to teach in J school, was that, you know, the press, media, television, news at one point was like a lost leader, right? That they were doing it in the 60s because they should. And the Federal Communications Commission kind of said the networks had to do news and had to do stuff of community benefit, so they did news. And then somebody in the 70s kind of began to figure out, we could make some money on this, right? And then it became a huge business. They used to say they have a license. If you had a local TV license, it was like a license to print money, right? Because the local stations, they'd only be 3, right? Maybe 4 at the most, and they just kind of shared the business, and they made a lot of money. Well, it's no longer the case. They don't nearly make the money they used to, and it's changed the news business. News went from being a loss leader to being, you know, a piggy bank to now we don't know where it is, and everybody's chasing eyeballs and clicks, right? You got to have more eyeballs, you got to have more clicks, and frankly, that waters down the news content, right? Because you're focused a lot on giving people what they want, and sometimes that goes up against what they kind of need to know.
And that's a good segue, because right now, if you're a conservative, there are channels for you. If you're a liberal, there are channels for you. You can turn on a channel now and hear only what it is that you want to hear.
Absolutely the case.
And it's the need to find out more information, to be a consumer of news. What do you think people need to be doing to be a good consumer of news?
Well, it's hard, just like anything else. I mean, you know, if you went to the grocery store and you see 85 different kinds of yogurt, for example, how do you pick the one you want to get? You settle on one, and then you just kind of buy that because there's too many choices, right? I think in a lot of ways that's what happens to news consumers. You settle on a show or a channel that you like that kind of fits your worldview, and you kind of just go with that because there's too many choices. And you got a life to live, right? You got your kids to pick up from school, you got other stuff to do. The news choice you're making is not your biggest concern of your day. I remember years ago, we had a consultant come in, and we talked about, and this was back when I was in radio, and they put up a picture of somebody hugging their radio, and they said, this is the picture that we in radio like to think of people as they're listening to the radio, right? They're focusing on it. They really, really care about what's on. They don't. They're listening to it for their own utility, but they might be going to the store or doing other things at the same time, not paying that close attention to what's going on. Well, that's really the way it really is now, right? They've got their tablet, they've got their other things going on. So it's very difficult for us in the news media, and I say us as though I'm still working, for us in the news media to get your attention and hold it. Right, and so it's a whole different world. It's become very, 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 very competitive.
There's a chill over the media now, or the news now. And
what do you mean there's a chill?
It seems to be that when you have the White House asking certain reporters not to join them, or when they're going to take foreign trips, the Secretary of State took a foreign trip without any reporters. Is that Is that the way it has been, or is that something new?
Well, I think if you're realistic about it, Donald Trump has certainly taken it to a very public level. But let's be real. The Obama administration was one of the least friendly to the press in a long time. And we talked about at the time how few press conferences he had, how little real availability there was for the president to talk to the media and reporters, because he didn't want to talk to us either. So, and it wasn't publicized as much, and he didn't say nasty things about the press the way President Trump does. But I go back to the campaign when President Trump was on everybody's show all the time, and he was available. He talked more than anybody else and had more availability. Look, I'm not a fan of the guy, but let's be real about, you know, he's in a love-hate relationship with the media. There's no question about that. But I think that to just blame him entirely for this chill that you're talking about is not entirely accurate.
You mentioned that he's in a love-hate relationship, and he does beat up on the press quite
Yes,
a bit.
he does. Oh, yeah, he gets nasty.
And is that going to serve him?
Well, it used to be that anybody who beat up on the press, it was considered a loser's game. You know,
why is that?
Because you were, in essence, trying to kill the messenger, and people kind of realize that, right? Oh, the press is mean to me. Yeah, but what you did was wrong, so they should be mean to you. Donald Trump has acted like he doesn't care that people consider it a loser's game, and he's been able to make hay by saying the media is not trustworthy. They're liberally biased. They're not on my side. Why will, sad, right?
Sad.
That's what he does.
I got a question for you. Now that we're talking about, kind of relating it back to what we're talking about checks and balances, the media being what most people consider the fourth branch of government, who do you think checks them, in your opinion?
That's a very good question. And sometimes nobody seems to, right? Sometimes people do things, reporters do things, and it's difficult to see some
or other reporters check.
Or other report. It's sometimes nobody checks them. I think the idea was the freedom of the press was sometimes the risk was that people sometimes would go overboard, but that the risk of censorship was greater than that risk, right? So there's certainly no question that sometimes in the media mistakes are made. I remember back during the Olympics when in the 90s in Atlanta, when they blamed that poor one man for setting that bomb, and he did not do it, right? His name was ruined. Right? I think he ended up suing and getting money, but it was a bad mistake on our part, right? And so the media can make mistakes, and it's very, very difficult to make up for them when your name has been plastered all around and slandered, But I think the risk of not having that is greater, and I think that was the decision. As Thomas Jefferson, what did he say? I'd rather, if given a choice between media and no government, and newspapers and what was it? Government and no newspapers, or newspapers and no government, I would gladly take the latter. Right, because the risk of not having that spotlight is so great.
Well, as we wind down, one of the things I wanted to cover was we hear the phrase fake news and an assault on news where they have an anonymous source.
Right.
But I hearken back to the days of Watergate when Richard Nixon was brought down by an anonymous source. Sure. And in fact, Deep Throat, which is who he was called, did not become public until just recently, just within the last couple of years.
That's right.
So if it's anonymous, is that how the press works? Do they use anonymous sources? Does that mean that the news is inherently unreliable?
No, anonymous sources are an age-old part of covering the news. And the idea being that there are ideas and things that need to be known from a person who just can't have their identity known. But you don't just use an anonymous source. I don't get a phone call in the middle of the night from somebody I don't know and say, look, this is the case, put it in the paper, and then I put it in there. That's not how it works. Usually an anonymous source is somebody that reporter knows very well who they are. They know their connection to the person involved. They know and have worked with that person before and know them to be reliable. They may even be able to corroborate the information from another source.
Well, is that how it normally is done?
And what you'll see now is, in newspapers, which I think is a good step in the right direction, they'll explain to you why a source is anonymous. They'll say, so-and-so, this source from the president who is withholding his name so he can speak more freely, or is withholding her name because she's not authorized to talk about this, or whatever the reason is for having the source be anonymous. They put it in the paper so you understand a little better how the process works. But usually when you have an anonymous source, an editor has to be in on who the person is and why you believe it to be true. I mean, it's not just again, that late night phone call or meeting in the garage with some guy and you don't know who he is and he hands you some papers and you just run with it. No, that's not good journalism.
But it is accepted journalism to use an anonymous
It is,
source.
but again, with the safeguards I just described, that the reporter knows who the person is, that they can verify that this person has access to the information that they say they
information
do,
may be
and
really
that
valuable.
and that they have a working relationship with that person many times that has helped them on stories before, so they trust that source. There's a lot to it.
I have a question that kind of rings in my mind, and the question is the responsibilities of a journalist.
Which we're going to have to wrap up very quickly.
So, in your opinion, what are the responsibilities of a journalist to the public?
The key responsibilities from my perspective are fairness and accuracy, and you have to do a gatekeeping thing because there's always so much information.
And I'm gonna wrap that up there. And there's always more information. There is so much more that we could discuss about this topic. It is my hope that you learned important and useful information from this program. I'd like to thank our guests, Derek McGinty and Andrew Hahn, for being with us today. We're grateful to them for taking their time to discuss separation of powers in the Fourth Estate. Let us know what you think of today's show and what topics you would like to see covered in future programs by emailing us at lawschoolforthepublic@gmail.com. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed the program. I would indicate that the press and news is a consumer product. I urge you to be a good consumer of that product. Go out, find the sources of information that you like, and secure it. For the Montgomery County Bar Foundation, I am David Schoenfeld. Thank you for watching.